Welcome to this live chat with Agave Health. Today, we are going to speak with Coach Christina about workplace accommodations. But first, just a reminder, Agave Health offers comprehensive behavioral health care for adults with ADHD, whether you are diagnosed or undiagnosed. And like I said, today we're going to speak about workplace accommodations. You may see this as kind of a hot button topic on LinkedIn, and it is something we've discussed here before. But for some, self accommodations are a better fit for the individual, and that specifically is what we're going to chat with Christina here about today. Christina, can you just take a moment, introduce yourself, please?
Yeah. My name's Christina Proctor. I'm a coach here with Agave, and I spent about 20 years in and around the corporate world. And I also work with organizations and clients to figure out what their best types of accommodations, whether formal through HR or informal, look like, or self-accommodations. So I'm excited to talk about this.
And that is precisely why we wanted to bring you
Yeah.
on today.
Yeah.
You've got a unique experience to speak specifically to this. So, can you first just, for those of us who haven't considered, why might someone choose to implement self accommodations rather than seeking formal workplace accommodations?
Yeah. So really what it comes down to are self-accommodations are a first step. Oftentimes when people are requesting formal accommodations, they don't always know what to ask for, what the options are. And I always encourage people to think about the ways that they can support themselves first, because you may not necessarily need to go to HR and go down that formal accommodation, even if you are, especially if you're not wanting to officially disclose a diagnosis that you have. So, informal or self accommodations, as we're talking about today, is a great way to start the process of figuring out how to best support yourself at work.
Um, on that note, can you briefly kind of explain the difference between formal accommodations versus self accommodations? So,
Absolutely.
what does formal accommodations entail?
Yeah, formal accommodations or like what's called reasonable accommodations in the United States is really like a modification or adjustment that is done in a job or within a system to be able to have somebody succeed in their role in various ways. So that could look like a lot of things. It could look like lessening a workload in one specific way so somebody can have more time to review content or work that they're working on. It could also look like a quieter place or an office with a door for them to be able to shut out distractions. There's lots of official formal accommodations. Typically, it has to be provided by somebody else. That's really what it comes
Gotcha.
down to is the organization has to approve it and it has to be reasonable in the United States. Informal or self accommodations, you don't have to have outside approvals. These are things that a person provides for themselves, accommodations to their daily life, either at home, work, or even in leisure activities.
Now, for formal accommodations, that like the paperwork process that requires a formal diagnosis as well. So, someone who's undiagnosed with ADHD could not seek formal accommodations.
It's typically, some organizations have different processes where they really are a
Mm,
little bit more flexible, but typically larger organizations that have a uh, accommodations formal process do require some type of paperwork from a provider stating why you need some type of accommodation and what it could possibly impact.
gotcha. Thank you so much. I just wanted
Yep.
to make that clear before we dive into
Yeah.
like you said, self accommodations is the first step. So let's dig into that.
And I've gone through this process a few times on my own in my own career too.
Um, so, what advice might you give someone who's hesitant to ask for accommodations or feels embarrassed about their ADHD at work?
I would really tell you that if they're, the question was if they're nervous about implementing self accommodations, why someone should, okay, sorry.
Why someone might be hesitant to ask for, like, to go through the formal process, essentially.
Yeah, somebody might be hesitant to go through a formal accommodation process at work because they may not want to disclose. They might have seen stigma to somebody else, or they just have no clue where to even go to get it, or what that how that could even help them. Most of the people that I've seen when they're going to get formal accommodations, it is in response to some type of uh, development plan that they got put on because of their disability or their ADHD specifically, or another type of disability negatively impacting their performance. Whereas if they had accommodations, they would be fine. But they're doing it in response. But sometimes people are hesitant because they're worried mostly about the stigma and they don't know what the
Mhm.
process looks like.
And what advice would you give to those individuals in that position?
I would say always first try to see what self accommodations you can do, whether that is small things you can do with your own schedule. And you always start off by asking yourself, what can I do to make this situation easier? Not how can I work harder, because you're already doing that. Probably 95% of the time, people are already working harder. What can you do to make things easier? Maybe that's learning to delegate. Maybe that's learning how to manage your time. Maybe that's learning when you work best and how you work best and implementing strategies from there. So you can start first with yourself and then move into, are there things that I would benefit from uh, being provided by my employer?
Gotcha. Now, let's dig more into the specific areas where you might be
Yeah.
able to accommodate yourself.
Mhm.
Starting with, what are those typical workplace challenges that individuals with ADHD often face?
Oftentimes, people with ADHD struggle in the workplace, struggle with attention to detail, potentially moving too fast through work, procrastination, as well as finishing projects. Those can be challenges, very real challenges. So, some tools that you can use that are self accommodations are things, for example, like dopamine use. Dopamine use, when you're implementing them, and we have a great blog on agavehealth.com that talks about the full description of what a dopamine use is. And basically, what it is a way for your brain to get the dopamine that it needs to move through different tasks or activities. And it does this, it isn't just a tool for work, it can be also a tool for home and leisure activities as well. But when you utilize a dopamine menu, it can help you move through tasks with something called sides. So it's like if you have trouble starting boring tasks, maybe you start pairing that with your favorite podcast episodes that come out when you're doing data entry. Maybe you have different types of tools that you can use to encourage yourself to move through those tasks so that they don't bog you down as much. Um,
Mm.
so so if you're challenged by procrastination because of the boringness aspect of it, a dopamine use is a great way to do that. Time blindness is something that's a challenge. Always encourage people when it comes to time blindness is to utilize tools, and this is a self accommodation I have, like a visual timer, so that they can actually see time pass. This is something that we're challenged by a lot, and understanding how long things take for better or for worse. And so giving yourself permission to utilize a visual timer, maybe challenge yourself to say, like, I feel like this task is going to take an hour. Maybe it only takes 10-15 minutes. And that way you can actually say, like, okay, I know that it doesn't take that long. The other tool that we utilize here with Agave is something called body doubling. So sometimes when you're procrastinating or feeling like you just don't want to start a task, body doubling is helpful because you have somebody else that's sharing either physical or virtual space with you. You're coming on and you're stating what your goal is to complete in the next hour. And then at the end, we check in. And so it adds in a layer of accountability and urgency to it so that you feel like you need to push through it to move in the task. So those are some of the challenges and some of the ways you can even self accommodate in the workplace without disclosing.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Um, Really briefly, I just wanted to, because you thought I had this thought when you showed your timer there. Um, what would you say the cost of self accommodation is? What might that
Mm,
range be?
mm,
Is that
yeah.
anything that brings on a heavy cost, or is it typically low cost or free
Yeah, a
for
lot of self
services?
accommodation recommendations that I work on with clients have low, meaning like $15 and less, or no cost. Sometimes it comes down to the cost is giving yourself permission to support yourself. and not having to white knuckle your way through your day. That's not how everybody else works. That's not something that is a thing that you need to carry with a badge of honor. You don't have to struggle. So a lot of it is the cost is giving yourself that permission, but most of it's low to no.
That's fantastic. Good to
Yeah.
know. Good to know.
Yeah.
Um, now, sorry, let me read my question again, make sure my brain's processing it.
Yeah.
So, how can someone with ADHD or executive dysfunction identify what their specific accommodations needs are at work? You had mentioned
Yeah.
previously about not knowing where to start.
Yeah.
So let's dig into that.
Yeah. So I always like to recommend by asking yourself questions and giving yourself a moment to really reflect. And so some of those questions can look like identifying what areas you thrive in. Why? Maybe you really thrive in ideation opportunities where you're openly discussing things with colleagues or doing research and then bringing in ideas. Maybe that's an area that you really thrive in because you like the novelty, you like the urgency, you like the interaction. So that's something to think about. Where do you thrive? From there, I like to bring up, where are your challenges? Where do they come in? Where do you see them arising? Maybe it's processing new information in a meeting immediately and then being told that you automatically need to respond. Maybe your brain isn't working that way because you get very overwhelmed in larger environments. It's really loud. It's hard to focus. Maybe, heaven forbid, you also have stuff going on outside of work. And so you're carrying that in with you. So that could be a challenge that arises. And so when you're thinking about self accommodations in the workplace, thinking about where you thrive and also where you're challenged by. The next step we get in, so that's kind of like interaction, either physically in the office or virtually. Either one of those work. The other thing is, think about if you feel comfortable or safe in your physical workspace. Are you constantly having to fight yourself from like not sitting down? Is there a way that you can make being at your workstation easier, more comfortable? Are you too cold, too hot? Even something as simple as having different types of drinks throughout the day to keep you stimulated and looking forward to the next hour, those are self accommodations. And so that's important to think about. Are you comfortable? And then what would your ideal workstation or work situation be? And then what do you have control over? So there's a lot of questions, and that really that's usually where I would start when you're thinking about what type of self accommodations you can make in the workplace.
Thank you so much. Yeah, what you were saying there about even just making sure you have the drinks necessary to get you through the day.
Yeah.
I think that's probably the first time I considered that. That could be a need. That's
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily just a want or something frivolous, but it's something really necessary, and it's also very simple.
Yes. And that brings up a great point too, Rachel, because oftentimes people with ADHD either don't feel or they ignore their bodily responses, their bodily needs, where they could be sitting there really needing to go to the bathroom and they either don't recognize the bodily response of you need to go to the bathroom, or they don't feel it at all because they're in hyper focus mode.
Mm-hmm.
So same thing with drinks, like forgetting to drink water. I had a day, I think
Cheers.
yesterday. Yeah, exactly. I had a day yesterday where I did not bring water with me to my meetings, and I didn't drink water all day. And I had a
Oh
really
my
terrible
goodness.
headache at the end of the day. And I did not give myself permission to have that accommodation of carrying around my big water bottle. And that's a self accommodation. If you're worried about other people making fun of you, it's like, well, I'm drinking water. Like, is that all? Like, who hurt you? Like, why are you making fun of me ignoring a water bottle? But that's what goes through our minds sometimes when we're thinking about self accommodations or what other people are going to think. And at the end of the day, if it helps you continue on with your day and feel good, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think the joke is, one drink for hydration, one for energy, and one for fun or comfort. And,
Yeah, the 3
you know,
drinks. Yeah, I
how
just
often do we
finished
look
my
at our
fun.
desk and see them?
I just cleaned off my desk right before this, so I only have this on my desk now. This is my afternoon drink. It's got like some electrolytes in it, and I make it in the morning
There you
before.
go.
So I clean off my desk and then get my afternoon drink. So
Well, and before the live too, I was like, I need to go get water. I've
yeah.
sat down here working all morning with coffee alone. It is time to
Mm-hmm.
go get water because if I don't, I'm gonna get all the way through my meetings and be like, oh, why do I have a headache?
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. So true.
But you know, having having access to the fluids you need to get through the workday, it is a need, and it's not necessarily
Mm-hmm.
something we think of when we're hyper focused, things like that. So it's
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I'm relating very much to this conversation.
Yeah.
um, do you have any other examples of self accommodations that can be implemented without needing approval from HR? I know you briefly spoke on those. I was just curious if any others had come to mind.
Yeah. So sorry. One of the things that people don't often consider are requesting a very clear and detailed agenda. And sometimes people are hesitant to ask for this. And really, what it does help with is it gets you mentally prepared and understanding the expectations of the conversation. I always recommend for people who are new to kind of giving details about what an agenda could look like is look up the 3 Ps process, which is for meetings: purpose, process, payoff. What is the intention of the meeting? Purpose. What is the process? Meaning Rachel's opens, Christina presents the thing that she learned at her latest workshop she attended, and somebody else is talking about a new process update. So that way we go and it's not just team updates. Well, am I supposed to talk about it? What am I supposed to talk about? What are your expectations? Do I need visuals? How long do I have? It's like understanding some of those expectations up front can help us with ADHD not over prepare and not get too anxious about it. Sometimes we have a tendency to lean into perfectionism that goes into rejection sensitivity dysphoria. So this gives, by having clear agenda items, it sets the expectation of what you want me to bring to the table. And so that I'm not doing too much and spending too much time on something that I really don't need to, or I come and I'm not as prepared as you expected, and then I
Mm,
feel like I failed and that there's a miscommunication. So requesting agenda clarity, maybe starting with the purpose, process, payoff method. Another thing is understanding how you process new and updated information can be a great way to implement self accommodations. Because what you can do is if you're in a meeting and maybe you do better, if you are in a meeting and you can process new information, like even with health plans, right? Like it's a lot of information to process. So having those presentations are good, but having the material ahead of time to process and read through even just a little bit, and then coming to the meeting, sitting through a presentation where you can ask questions because you were able to review beforehand, being able to articulate how you process information and having go-to phrases that you practice to say, thank you so much for this information. I need some time to process what we discussed. I would like to follow up on Tuesday. How does that sit with you? So
I
that's
love
like
that.
you've got a this is what I need. This is an expectation I can set, which is this is when I'm going to follow up. And how does that work to confirm that that's okay? Because they may have the expectation of approvals or follow up in that moment, and then that can open the door to a conversation of expectations and what makes sense. So understanding how you process new information and setting up agendas, those are
Thank
2 things that I often recommend first.
and that makes perfect sense too. Excuse me. Um, what tools or strategies can help with time management and staying organized in the workplace setting? I know this is something that comes up a lot, especially for folks with ADHD.
Right.
Let's dig into that a bit more.
So the number one tool that I give for people with ADHD, especially managers who are leading, either they themselves have ADHD and or their staff do, are clear deadlines. But I like to take it one step further. where we have milestone deadlines, because you could have a 6-month project and that is too much time for somebody like me. I would like to, in those moments, I empower my clients to say, I would like to have check-ins every 2.5, 3 weeks to give you an update. It doesn't matter if they're doing the work 2 hours before that 3-week update, they're still doing the work 3 weeks at a time. So when we talk about clear deadlines, it really should also be leaning into clear milestones. Where should we be at different times and why? The other thing is understanding the why behind the work. So when it comes to staying organized and time management, it does help us if we remind ourselves the why we're working on it, because that helps us understand why we're actually doing this work. It's not busy work. Otherwise, we have a tendency also to procrastinate. Time management is sometimes a struggle, especially with tasks that we don't fully understand or aren't connected with, because our brain is activated by urgency, novelty, passion, interest, and competition. So I want to encourage also, when it comes to time management, is if you're having trouble getting started on stuff or reinvigorating a project that you're like 70% done, think about ways that you can activate your brain. So that's another thing I would do. For staying organized, sometimes a big part of that is accountability. Is when you have to share resources with other people, that gives you the opportunity to say, oh, I know that Rachel's going to have access to all the blog research and connection. So I would benefit from having it in a very clear, well-defined, outlined way, because otherwise she's not going to know what's going on. And so sometimes that external accountability is helpful. Some people believe that they should all have internal accountability. I'm here to tell you it's okay to have external accountability to help you move stuff forward. So that's really some of the areas I would start in.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Another, trait of ADHD is overstimulation and distractibility. And I know that this particularly comes up with our folks that are working in an office, not necessarily workers from home, although I can actually attest to that right now. I've got my pets in here trying to distract me and get my attention while I'm on this live here. So, but for those who had that return to office, what advice do you have for them to manage that overstimulation and distractibility?
So I always like to start off and remind people that overstimulation is different for everybody. And sometimes this is an area where formal accommodations, self-accommodations do not replace formal accommodations, right? They just don't. There are still some things that an office can provide when it comes to overstimulation. And for the sake of our conversation with self-accommodations, what you can do for when it comes to distractibility, there's some pretty common things where, noise canceling headphones, maybe even overstimulation. Sometimes, depending on what you need, wearing clothes that are comfortable. So while you still want to dress professionally, perhaps in an office setting, or maybe you have a certain type of uniform you have to wear, making sure that there's ways that you can make it as comfortable as possible, maybe wearing the socks that are comfortable. A lot of times I hear from clients that they wear those pressure socks on the legs because it just helps them feel comfortable throughout the day. Maybe clothes that are not as restrictive when possible. So thinking about the different things that overstimulate you and what can also make you more comfortable. I know overhead lights are really draining for me. That's a huge challenge, as well as smells. So lunchtime in the office was a challenge. So what I ended up doing is that I would take my lunch around outside, even when the weather wasn't great, and I got outside and took a walk. And at the end of the day, that's also a regulation tool. But knowing what your triggers are and what you're challenged by, and figuring out ways that you can support yourself that way. So if you know that sounds are a challenge for you, making sure that you have the noise canceling headphones or a place where you can go where it's quiet. Smells, knowing when people cook certain things, or maybe you move away from where the microwave or the kitchen is, so it's not as close by. So thinking about different things that you can do that way.
And on the flip side of that coin, let's speak about hybrid and remote work environments.
Mm.
Those ADHD challenges are going to show up in all environments, including that. So, do you have any advice for someone who's working remotely and struggling with
Mm.
ADHD while they work?
Yeah. So when it comes to working remotely and having ADHD, a lot of times we have this idea that we can just kind of work whenever, wherever, wearing whatever. And we benefit from, I know it's so frustrating. We benefit from routine. As much as we don't want to say that, we benefit from routines and some consistency. Now, what that can look like is when you're working remotely is having a routine that is scaled up and scaled down. The number one, that's one of the number one ways to make sustainable habits is be like, this is what a perfect morning could look like. This is what a medium morning could look like. This is what a low barrier to entry morning can look like, right? And so when you're working remotely, wanting to improve your time management, working through a hardy routine to get you into work mode is key. And giving yourself the different type of accommodations around you is helpful. So my setup at home right now, I've got a standing desk. I've got one of those crisscross chairs so I can sit weirdly however I want to. I've got windows with air just moving through, so my dog in here doesn't make it smell like dog all the time. And I've got different types of lights. And so I have made it so I'm able to work in my office pretty effectively and efficiently, and it's comfortable.
That speaks so much to me, just thinking of the last house that we lived in, and I didn't have a dedicated office space, and just how much of a difference that has made for me working remotely. And I
Yeah.
know that, so many people who work remotely, they're trying to do so while also, rearing children and,
Right.
taking care of pets. And there's that, belief that, oh, if you're working from home, you can just do chores too, or it's fine because you're not really working.
Yeah.
But it's like, no, that's not really
No,
it.
no, no.
I The challenge is real. The challenge is real.
Yeah.
Let's just
Then that brings me into setting realistic expectations for yourself when it comes to self accommodations. And that's a good point too, where that is a huge self accommodation, is learning how to set realistic expectations for yourself. I'm glad you brought that up, because that's a great place to start too. What is a realistic expectation I have?
Well, and the reason why my home office was in the living room in our last place is
Mhm.
because I tried the basement, but the lack of natural light drove me crazy.
Yeah.
So so I moved into
Yeah.
the living room, but then it became just a huge, very vulnerable to any and all distraction. So today I'm very grateful to have a dedicated home office space. I wish I had a door, but I do okay without it.
Yeah. Fair. Fair.
Um, Now, some of what you've talked about today with self accommodation, it does involve other people at times, right? We're not
Mhm.
necessarily in writing asking for a formal accommodation for something, but there are times where you are communicating with others in your office, at your work, either
True.
your manager or your coworkers. So, what advice do you have for individuals with ADHD that are wanting to communicate their needs effectively to those others around them?
Yeah, that's a great question, because you're right. Self accommodations don't always just involve you. So that's always when I lean into the phrase, the I work best when blank. I work best when I can process information for a little while and return back to it. I work best when I can have a quiet place to think, to do deep work. I work best when I can get to work before everybody else, to start my workday before I get distracted. So that way you're able to communicate your needs on, and that is more of a, it comes off as more of a work style than an accommodation, because that's a reasonable thing to request, right? Like I work best when I can get X, Y, and Z, as long as it's, you know, reasonable within the workday. If I get in at 8:30 instead of 9 and the workday is fine with that, then it's okay. So I always tell people start off utilizing that phrase, I work best when, and fill in the blank. And that's really a way to start learning to advocate for yourself.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And that's such a huge theme with self-accommodation is self-advocacy.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think that is really just the perfect note to end our live chat on today. Thank you so much for coming in and speaking about self-accommodations for our watchers and anyone who's watching the replay as well. And if you are struggling at work accommodating your ADHD and you need a little bit of extra help, please know that we here at Agave Health are happy to assist with ADHD coaching. We have also launched an ADHD evaluation service. So if you do need to seek out formal accommodations with a diagnosis, we can help you be evaluated for that diagnosis. And yes, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.